Just remembered I exist outside my own perception and people can see me and form an opinion about me. I've seen this meme and similar sentiments shared around online by a considerable number of people, and I've always found it interesting that so many people seem to relate to it. That something as basic as being perceived by another person can cause such discomfort or disgust or even horror. There's certainly a lot of psychological ways in which one could analyze and explain this phenomenon, but while reading the French existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, I noticed that Sartre explains precisely this phenomenon in philosophical terms, as being an inescapable aspect of human existence. At least he does so in his early work, most notably Being and Nothingness. So how would the early Sartre explain this feeling? Some of the most famous moments in Sartre's philosophy are the situations that he depicts in order to illustrate a point. One such famous moment is his description of a situation in which you are in a hotel hallway looking through a keyhole into one of the rooms, curiously watching the people inside it. Here you are a subject, freely choosing to gaze upon a set of objects. But then, suddenly another person enters the hallway and sees you voyeuristically looking through the keyhole. And you suddenly realize that, in the act of watching, you yourself are being watched. Suddenly, you become conscious of yourself not as a subject looking at objects. Suddenly, you yourself are the object inside another person's perception. This realization of yourself as the object of another person's gaze, in this case, manifests itself in shame. It is as if the center of gravity in your experience is suddenly taken away from you and placed in the position of another person. And this experience of shame is also to an extent an experience of unfreedom. Suddenly, as you realize you're being watched, you no longer view yourself on your own terms, but in terms of how the other person views you. It's almost as if you are constrained, trapped by their gaze, and instead of a free being, you become an object in someone else's mind, subject to all of their potential thoughts and judgments about you. When I experience myself as a subject, I am free to determine what I will do and what kind of person I am. But once I am trapped in another person's gaze, I am subject to a certain preconceived notion of who I am. My freedom seems to be limited by it, as I ultimately cannot control how the other person will view me. Sartre says that this is the ultimate meaning of the myth of Medusa. The gaze of the other turns me into stone, an object. And this horror at being watched is also partly the meaning of the famous quote in Sartre's play No Exit, in which the character Garçon, while being gazed upon by other people, famously says,
"Do you remember all those stories they used to tell us about the brimstone and the fires and the torture chambers? Old wives' tales. No. There's no need of red-hot pokers. Hell is other people."
As a subject, I have limitless freedom and infinite potential, but as an object, I am judged and narrowly defined. This contradiction often involves the feeling that I must conform to the conception another person has of me. The tension between how I view myself and how I am viewed by another human being can be quite a painful one. And I think this is precisely the sentiment that this meme expresses. In Sartre's philosophy, this conflict, this tension, is an inescapable aspect of living in a world with other people. Conflict is the original meaning of being for others, he writes. While I attempt to free myself from the hold of the other is trying to free himself from mine. While I seek to enslave the other seeks to enslave me. It's quite a cynical view of interpersonal relationships, which Sartre believed applies even to romantic relationships. I have a certain conception of who my lover is, and I try to possess them as someone essentially belonging to me. And likewise, my lover has a certain conception of who I am, and tries to possess me in turn. And while on the one hand I want to possess my lover, on the other hand I also want them to love me freely. There is thus a tension at the very heart of the relationship which cannot be resolved without killing the relationship itself. For Sartre, all human relationships have this tug of war between subject and object, between the watcher and the watched, between freedom and constraint. When I am trapped by the other person's gaze, I can either try to reassert my freedom against them and suffer all the conflict, fear, and uncertainty that comes with it, or I can disavow my freedom by trying to conform as much as possible to the conception the other person has of me, thereby accepting my status as object. And yet, whichever option I choose, I am still choosing it freely. I cannot escape my own freedom even if I disavow it, even if I deceive myself into thinking that I can. And it is partly this point about the inescapability of freedom that makes Sartre an existentialist. Later, when Sartre came to identify more closely with Marxism, he rejected this early view of interpersonal relationships, arguing that what he was describing was not, in fact, an essential aspect of human existence, but only an aspect of life in an alienated society, which could be overcome with revolutionary solidarity. Whether you agree more with his earlier pessimism or his later historical view, that is a free choice I leave up to you. Before we end, I'd like to thank my wonderful and talented wife for drawing art for this video, and I'd like to thank my patrons, who objectify me with their gaze. 404 Error, Just Then Do It, Andre Oliva, Archive Transients, Beetle Scratches, Ben E., Celsius Enjoyer, Circadia, Daniel Zotner, Evie Rosk, Eric Owens, Francois Yue Wu, Harbin Moths, Hong Kong Aesthetics, John D. Pagani, Katy Perry Is, John Bennett Ramsey, Clement Feiss, M. Lim, Max Bendick, multiple outtakes pronouncing Baudrillard, Nathaniel Lark, Paul Winfer, PDX J. Morris, Polecat, Rachel Ann, Radical Q, Sky, Stax Murner, Cybundit, Tendies123, The Empty Set, Venice, Victor Redko, Yesterday's Rice, as well as all of these wonderful patrons. As you can see, this video is a lot shorter than my typical upload. I've decided to start putting out short-form videos in addition to the long ones. That way I can introduce a greater number of concepts and do so more frequently, so people have something to watch while waiting for one of the big videos. Let me know if you like this idea and if you'd like to see more short-form uploads. Thank you.